In this podcast episode, we're going to talk about how do we find real estate deals and how do we find owner financing deals, negotiate for them, what to look for, what to ask for. This is Sam Kwak, and you're watching and listening to the Kwak Brothers podcast show. Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Sam Kwak, real estate investor, one of the Kwak Brothers here. And today in this episode, we're going to talk about all about how do we find the right real estate deals, and let alone how do we find them for owner financing acquisition purposes. Now, before we get to the main topic of the podcast for this episode, we're going to talk about the book of the podcast, and that is E-Myth Revisited. And guys, this book I've read about a year ago and has definitely shaped and changed the way that I run my business. Now, I know it seems like almost every book that I read changes my business. Well, I got to tell you, it is the truth, right? Every book has a golden nugget that either shapes my business entirely or changes and alters in a way. Even if it's a little thing, a little detail, it matters a lot. So this book, the way that it changed my business and the way that it helped grow is that I realized that the way that I was running my business, I was more of a solopreneur, right? I was running my own business, myself, my brother, and we were the only ones working on our business. Now, the problem is that sooner or later, you actually end up becoming your own employee in your business. You're working 70, 80, 90 hours a week to the tune where you may make good, decent amount of money, but you have zero time freedom, right? So the purpose of us getting into real estate investing and into this business is for the time freedom to spend the time in a way that it benefits us. We get to spend time with our family, vacationing, whatever it may be. So that's not going to be possible if you don't have the right team, right system, right process in place where you can virtually walk away from the business, but the business still generates money for you. So Michael Gerber, phenomenal author, writes in a very anecdotal way, in a story form. It's not boring. Actually, it's really interesting. Check it out because this book is going to show you how to systemize your business in a way that you can literally walk away from the day-to-day operation of your business and you can still generate cash flow. So that is hugely important. I definitely recommend it. And what I'll do is, as always, in every episode of our podcast, I'll go ahead and leave the purchase link from Amazon in the description box below. Definitely grab a copy. You will not regret it. So that is the book of the podcast, E-Myth Revisited by Michael E. Gerber. All right, guys. So let's talk about the main topic for today, which is how do we find the deals and how do we find them for owner financing? Now, generally, a good tip for anything, if you want to achieve anything, is you want to begin with the end in mind, right? What is the finished outcome? What is the result that you want? So if your result that you want is you want to be able to buy an owner finance, or if you want to buy a deal, buy a property with using owner financing as your acquisition strategy, whether you want to do a fix and flip or whether you want to do a buy and hold, multifamily, right, single family, whatever you want, owner financing is definitely an acquisition strategy that can definitely help you get into a real estate deal, possibly and potentially without using your own credit. So before you get started, before you do any sort of negotiation or any sort of research process when dealing with the deal, you want to know what your ultimate outcome is. What is the end product that you want to come up with, right? So for me, 80% of the time, I'm looking for properties to acquire using owner financing and then buying and holding it, right, for cash flow purposes. So you have to be very exact to the tune of what do you want, right? What is the exact outcome that you want? Because if you know what the exact outcome that you desire, you can reverse engineer those outcomes and figure out what the process it would take to get to the desired outcome. But if you start off with thinking, okay, I'm just going to do this, this, and this, I'm going to do owner financing negotiation, and poof, I'm going to have money, right? Necessarily doesn't work that way. In fact, if you go through that way, you're actually getting controlled by the deal instead of you controlling the deal, right? You might want to write that down, right? You don't want the deal to control you. You want to control the deal. Because if you don't have an exact outcome or an exact process to get to that outcome, the deal is virtually taking over your life and your calendar, right? Telling you what you need to do instead of the other way. So it's really important to know how to engineer an entire deal from start to finish and what the outcome is going to be. Okay, so enough with that. How do we start to look for deals, right? Whether it's you're doing a fix and flip, buy and hold, short sale, wholesale, whatever it may be, right? This sale, that sale, whatever sale you want to do, okay? So initially what I do, and this is something that that Johnny Dassauer talked about in our earlier episode podcast. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and roll that clip right away to show you guys what he said.
People are like, I can't find any deals.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on. Do I need to get my license? No. You need to look for people. In other words, your network needs to grow. Because if I can tie into you and you're an agent or you're a real estate investor, or better yet, you're just someone in my network that is getting divorced or is sick and has to sell their property or whatever, then you have much more options there. In the highest point in the market, which I feel like we're very close to if we already haven't passed that, it's tough to find properties.
Yes.
Stop looking for properties. Look for 2 other P's, and then we'll wrap this. 2 other P's.
No, you go as long as you want.
Stop looking for properties and look for 2 P's. Look for people, number 1, and look for problems.
Okay, so you guys clearly got Johnny, right? Johnny did it pretty much said and did the justice there, right? Don't look for the people don't look for the deal necessarily, but look for the people, right? If you have people and the problems, you may have a deal there. So I'll give you 1 or 2 examples of how to find the deals, because I really want to get to the whole process of negotiating for owner financing. But one good example of finding a good deal, as far as what I look for, is I look for rent signs. And I usually call that for rent sign asking if they're interested in selling the property rather than renting it out. Now, the psychology behind that, guys, is that 90% of landlords, who are renting, putting their property out for listing, most likely, if they're running to multiple days or multiple months of vacancies, they're gonna start to stress out, right? I'm like, man, what do I do, right? I got 3 months of vacancies. No one wants to rent my property. Maybe I should consider selling it. So the psychology behind that, and the reason why we go after the for rent signs, is to look for those desperate landlords, or even landlords that are looking to retire, right? If the landlord's if she or he is in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in terms of their age, then they're going to want to retire, right? They're going to want to look for an out strategy. Now, of course, if they have a family taking over, that's another story. But a lot of times what I'm seeing here is that if the landlord is the one that's managing the property, their family does not want to do anything, but don't want anything to do with the real estate property, right? Because they see the hardship, they see the tenants, right? The problems, right? All those things, they're seeing that. So, and of course, having a property manager will take care of most of that. But a lot of the old school landlords, they tend to manage the property themselves. So one way that you can look for deals is to call for rent sign and see if they're interested in selling. Now, I will tell you, at least 30 or 40 times, right? When you call these for rent signs, they're going to say no. But when you do get that yes, right? Not only is it off market, but you now have an opportunity to negotiate with that person, to meet that person at the property to see if this is a worthwhile doing deal. So one of the things that I do is I go talk to the owner. I say, hey, listen, I do notice that you're interested in selling. Why don't we meet at the property? Let's discuss about you selling it. I do want to see what the property looks like to see if there's any issues, maintenance problems, right? So I'm meeting the owner, the seller, at the property, doing a little tour. But more so than paying attention to the property itself, I'm looking for the problems that the seller is having. I'm looking for why is he or she looking to sell, right? If the property looks great, good shape, decent shape, whatever it may be. In fact, I prefer to buy something that's completely out of shape. But if the property looks decent and they're wanting to sell it, find out why they want to sell it. And a lot of times it could be due to retirement or a sudden life event, emergency, right? Their spouse may have contracted a disease or cancer or whatever it may be, but it's very unfortunate. But identify what the problem is. And usually when you identify the problem is, the solution sort of speaks for itself. So here's what I do when it comes to owner financing. And a lot of times, what I look for are these 3 things. So write this down. If you're watching this podcast or if you're listening, you can come back to YouTube and watch it later on. If you're listening to this on iTunes or SoundCloud, you can obviously write this down as well, unless you're driving, which I don't suggest that you try to write things down when you're driving or working out, right? So 3 things that I look for. Number 1 is I'm looking for owners that have owned their properties for more than 7 years, 7 or more years of ownership. And I'll come back to why I say that. Second thing I look for are owners that are in their 50s through 70s. Okay. And obviously, I mentioned it briefly before. I want to look for owners that are looking to retire. And I don't want the owners to do what's called a 1031 securities exchange. I don't want the owners to sell and then to go and buy another real estate. I'll tell you why in just a second. The third thing that I'm looking for in a seller is that they have their property inside of an LLC, limited liability company, or some sort of a holding entity, right? Whether it's a trust, an LLP, which is very rare, or a corporation, right? Whatever it may be, it just has to be an entity that holds the property in. So let's go back to the seven or more years in ownership. And here's why that's important. And this is probably the most important part of my negotiation process, is the whole concept of depreciation. Now, I'm not talking about market depreciation, which is driven by the economic forces. I'm talking about accounting depreciation. So for those who don't know, the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, allows people, and by the way, I'm not an accountant, so make sure you consult with an accountant about this, but the IRS allows investors depreciate non-owner occupied investment properties for 27.5 years. Now, the logic behind that is properties, when you buy a real estate, over time, it's going to go through wear and tear, right? It's not going to look the same as you first bought it or built it. It's going to go through some wear and tear. Now, when it does go through wear and tear, the IRS basically says, listen, the property isn't going to look the same over time. So what we're going to allow you to do is we're going to allow you to take a piece of the equity, right, what you bought it for, and write it off as an expense against the income that is being generated from the investment property. So let's say you have a $100,000 property that you bought, right? So for those in California, you're like, where do we find these $100,000 property, right? So just stay with me. This is a math thing. So if you have a $100,000 property and you depreciate it for, let's say, 27.5 years, and this is a residential, commercial will be 39. But in residential property, you can depreciate for 27.5 years. What that basically means that you can take $100,000, divide it by 27.5 years, which should get you around $3,300. Let me do the math here real quick. I got my calculator. So $100,000 divided by 27.5 years is actually $3,600, roughly, give or take. So what that means is if you have a $100,000 property and that's what you bought it for, you can take $3,600 of depreciation and claim it as an expense against the rental income. So if you collected, let's say, $10,000 of rental income in a given year, you can take $10,000 gross income minus the $3,600 of depreciation and minus all the other expenses, insurance, taxes, and so on. So the depreciation is a tax saving strategy. It defers taxes. There's a better word. It defers taxes, right? Again, I'm not an accountant, so you want to speak to an accountant about this. But when you defer those taxes, there's also a catch-22. Right? The IRS has a philosophy, and this is not their official philosophy. This is my philosophy about what they think is their philosophy. Okay, if you get what I just said there. So my philosophy about the IRS is usually you have to pay taxes somewhere, right? You don't get to run away. You don't get to just not pay taxes. The IRS, it appears that they have a philosophy where you either pay taxes now or you pay taxes later. So in this case, when you're depreciating a property, what you're doing is you're just deferring those taxable liabilities in a future date. So let's say you bought the property for $100,000. You kept it for 30 years, which you maxed out your depreciation for 27.5 years. What that basically means is when you go and sell the property for, let's say, $100,000. So you bought it for 100, you sell it for 100. What happens is when you sell it for $100,000, that entire $100,000 could be subject to taxes. And I'm not talking about just capital gains. I'm not talking about, some of these other taxes. You actually have to pay ordinary income tax on that $100,000. So what I'm basically saying is you have to claim that $100,000 as income in your next year's taxes. Now, if you want to get the technicality of this, look up Internal Revenue Code 1235 and 1250. I'm sorry, it's 1245 and 1250, I believe. Let me double check that for you, because I don't want to be fake news, right? I don't want to be like some of those news stations out there. Definitely not. But let me double check what the Internal Revenue Code is, and I'm sure some of you accountants, or they know the answer or may not. I don't know. Okay, so it is 1245 and 1250. And there's a difference between the two codes. Definitely look it up yourself or ask your favorite accountant. But if you go to your 26 U.S. code, subsection 1245, gain from disposition of certain depreciable property. So definitely go check out the rule as far as what the IRS or the law says about how this transaction works. So basically, if you bought it for $100,000, depreciate it for 27 and a half years, and sell it for $100,000, the rule basically says that $100,000 is subject to ordinary income, which depending on where your tax bracket is, it could be anywhere between 15% to all the way to 35%. Again, I'm not an accountant. I have to say this 3 times, okay? Just to make sure you guys understand that I am not giving you guys any tax advice. Make sure you go talk to an accountant to get your tax advice and as well as clarity on this matter. But as far as having to sell that property and pay up to 35% taxes, no seller would ever want to pay 35% taxes when they have to sell their own property, right? That's $35,000 potential for tax liability in this scenario that I just painted here. So here's why it's so important. This concept is so important to the negotiation process of owner financing. And that is because owner financing, especially contract for deed, the official term is agreement for I'm losing my track of thought here. Okay, it's articles for agreement for deed is the official language for what contract for deed is. But if you're doing contract for deed, basically what that means is the seller is selling the property to you without giving you the deed until the seller financing has been fully paid off, right? That's the idea there. So when the deed does not get transferred, it's technically not a taxable event. Meaning, if the seller sells that property using contract for deed, the seller gets to defer those taxes, the $35,000 taxes. It will postpone those taxes. So how that works is, let's say you bought the property from the seller financing for 20-year amortization. Okay, so over 20 years, you're paying monthly payments. Yes, you're going to pay interest, right? So in those 20 years, every month, the seller, part of that payment is principal and the other part is interest. The principal that the seller is collecting is subject to that taxes, right? The subsection 1245 and 1250, they have to pay the up to 35% taxes on the principal. Now, of course, they also have to pay taxes for the interest that they're collecting because that's also subject to taxes. But what it does is it slows down. They don't have to pay the lump sum, in this case, $35,000 to the IRS, right? So this is a great strategy if the seller doesn't want to have to pay a huge chunk to the Internal Revenue Service, right? Our best friends. So make sure, again, consult with an accountant about this. But if you're dealing with a seller that has owned the property for a fairly long time, to where they have depreciated it, at a long time, that's why I said 7 or more years as an investment property. If they depreciate it for a very long time, then it's a very high chance that they have to pay what's called depreciation recapture taxes, which could be up to 35% tax. And then contract for deed seller finance can definitely help them postpone those taxes. So this is why it's such a hugely important fulcrum, sort of like a linchpin to my negotiation. That's usually the leverage that I use to get the negotiation done. Now, the reason why I said we don't want the seller to do a 1031 exchange is because 1031 securities exchange is another strategy to postpone those taxes. So hence why I don't want the seller to do a 1031 exchange, because that they can get away with pretty much my negotiation power is lost. So that's that. Now, when it comes to the LLC component, the reason why I mentioned LLC, a couple things there. What I noticed is that people who own their properties inside of an LLC tend to be more sophisticated of an investor. So they're more likely to take risk. They're more likely to listen to what you have to say about owner financing. They're not strangers to it, and they may have bought properties using owner financing. So I love dealing with individuals who are experienced versus someone who's a homeowner and they have never bought a property other than what they're selling, because they tend to freak out when you mention owner financing. They're like, "What the heck is that? Right? What is that? Am I getting scammed?" And the realtor involved in this is like, "Oh my gosh, am I getting scammed? Right? Do I have to surrender my commissions?" So I rather deal with investors when it comes to owner financing. Now, with that being said, the other component is that more than likely, the seller may have more than just one properties if they have an LLC. So if they're looking to get out and they're looking to retire, I want them to sell the entire portfolio to me at owner financing. I mean, that'll be awesome, right? If I can buy 30 single families like that, right? Just one transaction, one closing, boom, right? All the cash flow at once. So that's ideal. That's definitely what I want to achieve. So I remember talking last Friday. I had a mastermind dinner up in New Jersey. I said, ideally, what you want is to buy a 100-unit property or 100-unit portfolio, seller finance, have an investor come and do the do the down payment, and boom, you have 100-unit cash flow right there in one transaction. But does that happen all the time? No, right? It's a pipe dream, right? I wish it would happen. That'd be awesome. But very rarely you're going to get that type of sellers. If you do, awesome. More props to you. Wish you success, right? But very unlikely. So that being said, that is usually my owner financing negotiation process. And what I might actually do is Daniel and I, actually Daniel's sick today. I was going to do that this week, but Daniel and I will actually role play as far as how owner financing works. So if you want to stick around and listen to the role play of owner financing, so Daniel can play the seller, I'll play the buyer, or vice versa. It doesn't matter. Come back next podcast episode. Tune into the podcast episode, and we'll release that video. We haven't made it yet, but we'll do it. I think it's a brilliant idea. I just thought about it. Right? Maybe I'm a genius. I don't know. Anyway, enough. Inflating my ego here. But so next episode, we're gonna have Daniel here, and we're gonna do we might do a role play. Right? Daniel can play the seller. I'll play the buyer, and we'll negotiate. He'll probably give me a hard time. That's usually how it works. But you guys will get to see how that process will actually work. Usually, what objections get thrown around. What questions do I ask? How do I rebuttal against some of these objections that may come the way? So what you want to do, guys, is subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast, because you definitely don't want to miss the day when it rolls out. Make sure you hit the bell icon, because sometimes if you don't hit the bell icon, you don't get the notification indicating that a new episode of podcast has been released. So subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon, because you do not want to miss what's coming up. In fact, October 2nd, which is in a couple weeks, 2 weeks, actually, yeah, a week after next week, we're going to have Mr. Jeff Armstrong, who is a master of seller finance notes. He's going to come to us and talk to us about that particular strategy. Jeff is a brilliant man with seller finance notes. He's actually one of the best seller finance note broker in the country. So honored to have him in our podcast. Make sure you join that as well. So next week, probably on the 25th, we'll release the role play between my brother and I with seller financing. And on the 2nd, you definitely want to tune in with Jeff Armstrong. And you do have the choice to tune in live on October 2nd at 7 p.m. Central Time. And what you want to do, if you want to participate as an active audience, a live audience, you want to ask questions to Jeff, what you want to do is subscribe to our newsletter on thekwakbrothers.com. Again, that's thekwakbrothers.com. I'll leave the link down below. Subscribe to our newsletter, and you do not want to miss having the opportunity to be a live audience with Jeff. You can ask questions, no holds bar, unless you're asking something inappropriate. Okay, but you get to ask Jeff any questions you want on October 2nd. Be sure you subscribe to our mail, our newsletter. Now, if you're watching this podcast episode after October 2nd, we have plenty more podcasts that are coming up, and as well as special guests. If you want to join as a live audience, be sure you subscribe to our newsletter, because we have plenty of cool things coming out down the road. And we also are one of the biggest researchers when it comes to when is the market going to crash, right? I mean, I'm literally obsessed. People think I'm crazy, but I am actually obsessed with the fact that the market may crash coming next year or 2020. I know I seem like one of those doomsday, crazy person. I'm actually not, okay. But I'm being very, very active as to when will the next market crash would happen. So if you want any updates, any new laws, any new policy changes that I think may result into into a market crash, I'll have that being also released in the newsletter. So basically, just sign up for the newsletter. It's nothing but good stuff. Okay, I'm not going to send you spam. I'm not going to ask you to give me money, right? I'm not going to tell you how I have a Lamborghini in my garage, and the important thing is knowledge, right? I'm not going to do that. All right. So I'll give you nothing but value. And you can always unsubscribe if you decide to hate me and for some reason you don't like me anymore, I guess. But anyhow, guys, I hope this episode helped with your journey of becoming a successful real estate investor. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I will see you guys in the next podcast episode. Ciao. Well, hello there. You made it to the end of this video. Congratulations. And that probably means that you like our video and you love what we did. So be sure, if you want to get more information, more YouTube videos from us about real estate investing, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon to make sure that you get notifications on our future videos about real estate investing.